My son left US behind. My name is Robert. I am 72 years old. For almost 15 years, my wife Emily and I waited for our son to come home. Every morning, Emily would open the curtains and look toward the road outside our little house. She was hoping that one day she would see a familiar car stop in front of our gate, hoping she would hear the voice she missed more than anything. Dad, Mom, just the simple words we hadn't heard in years. Emily, Aniwell, wealthy people. I worked as a mechanic and Emily worked at a local bakery. Our greatest joy wasn't money. It was our son, Daniel. As Daniel grew older, our lives revolved around him. We attended every school event, every soccer game, and every performance, even when we were exhausted or when we couldn't afford it. One winter, our heating system broke. We didn't have enough money to replace it, so Emily and I slept under extra blankets for weeks. But when Daniel mentioned needing a new computer for school, we somehow found the money. Parents are strange that way. We can tolerate discomfort ourselves, but seeing our children struggle feels unbearable. Daniel grew a smart young man. The night he received an acceptance letter into a prestigious university in another state, we both cried. Our son was leaving, but he was leaving for something wonderful. At least, that's what we believed. The morning we drove him to campus remains one of the happiest days of my life. When we unloaded his belongings, he hugged us both. "I'll make you proud," he promised. I smiled and said, "Son, you've already done that." For the first few months, everything felt perfect. Daniel called every Sunday. Emily would prepare coffee before every phone call, as if it were a special family event. In many ways, it was. But then life started moving faster. His calls became shorter, then less frequent. At first, we understood. He was busy, building a future and meeting new people. That was normal. At least, that's what we told ourselves. Months turned into years. The conversations with Daniel grew shorter. 5 minutes, 3 minutes, sometimes only a text message. Eventually, entire weeks passed without hearing from him. Emily would sit on the edge of our bed at night, staring at her phone. "Maybe he's just busy," she would whisper. I would nod, even though a small part of me was beginning to hurt inside. After graduation, Daniel accepted a high-paying job in a large city filled with glass buildings. We were truly proud. But something changed after that. The distance no longer felt measured in miles. It felt measured in memories. Whenever we invited him home, there was always a reason to refuse. Work, meetings, travel, deadlines. Next month, next holiday, next year, he would say. Eventually, even those promises stopped. One Christmas, Emily spent 3 days preparing Daniel's favourite meal. The table was decorated, the gifts were wrapped, and everything was ready. We waited and waited. Then his text message arrived on my phone. "Sorry, Mom, something came up." "Maybe next year." I watched Emily read those words. She smiled, but her eyes instantly filled with tears. That night, she packed away the untouched food. I pretended not to notice. Because sometimes, the kindest thing a husband can do is silently share his wife's heartbreak. More years passed. Our hair turned grey, our bodies slowed, and the house became quieter. Yet every birthday, every Christmas, every holiday, we continued setting an extra place at the table, just in case. Not because we expected him, but because hope can become a habit, and habits are hard to break. We lived in this silent loop of waiting, protecting each other from the painful truth that our only son had forgotten us. Then came the year everything changed. It was the year my beautiful Emily got terribly sick. The doctors told me that her heart was failing, and we didn't have much time left. Sitting by her hospital bed, watching her breathe weakly, I realised that time was running out for both of us, even in her weakest moments. When she could barely open her eyes, she would look toward the hospital door every time it opened. She didn't say his name, but I knew who she was looking for. She wanted to see her boy one last time before the darkness took her away. Daniel didn't know about her sickness because he hadn't answered our calls in 6 months. Looking at my wife's pale face, a sudden wave of strength and anger filled my 72-year-old body. I realised I couldn't just sit here and watch her die with a broken heart. I stood up, gently kissed Emily's forehead, and whispered, "I will bring him home, active." I went back to our little house, took my old jacket and packed a small bag. I didn't know exactly where his big corporate office was, and I didn't know how a simple old mechanic from a small town would survive in a massive city of glass and steel. But it didn't matter. I finally decided to find my son, no matter how far away he had gone, and no matter what Dax Hatley truth was waiting for me in that big city. I locked the front door of our empty house, looked at the road one last time, and stepped into the cold morning air. My journey to save my wife's last wish had just begun. The doctor delivered the news on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Emily had been feeling tired for months, and the tests confirmed a serious, dangerous heart condition. The doctor hesitated when asked if she had enough time, and that silence terrified me. That night, I stared at an old family photograph of Daniel when he was 12. The next morning, Emily touched my shoulder and said, "I just want to see him again." She meant now, while there was still time. That afternoon, I made a decision. I was going to find my son, no matter how far I had to travel. The search wasn't easy. The phone number no longer worked, and weeks turned into months of dead ends. Finally, an old colleague told me Daniel had worked for a financial company in Chicago. I boarded a bus immediately, but when I arrived at the massive glass building, the receptionist frowned. "Daniel Carter no longer works here. Another dead end." As I sat on a bench in the crowded city, wondering if I had failed, a man approached me. It was Mark, Daniel's former co-worker. We spoke for an hour, and he revealed something I never expected. Daniel hadn't left us because of success. He had left because everything had fallen apart. Years earlier, Daniel invested all his savings into a business. The company collapsed, and he lost everything. His career suffered, his marriage ended, and depression followed. He stopped talking to everyone, Mark said quietly. He was ashamed. Ashamed. The word echoed in my mind. For years, I believed my son had abandoned us. Now I knew he was running from himself, thinking that failure made him unworthy of love. The next morning, Mark called with a recent address. I rented a car and drove to an old, worn building. I climbed the stairs slowly, stood in front of apartment 17, and knocked. The door opened slowly. There he was. Older, thinner, tired, but unmistakably my son. Daniel's eyes widened. "Dad?" I felt my throat tighten. "Hello." "Son." Tears filled his eyes. and he whispered words I never expected. I didn't know how to come back. Standing there in that dark hallway, looking at Daniel, the years of silence suddenly made sense. It wasn't arrogance or indifference. It was fear. The fear of disappointing the people who loved him most. Sometimes people don't run away because they stop loving you. Sometimes they run away because they believe they no longer deserve your love. I stepped forward and embraced him tightly. For a moment, he resisted. Then he broke down completely, crying like a child who had been carrying too much weight for too long. Inside his small, empty apartment, I grabbed his hands. Daniel, we never cared about your success or your money. We only cared about you, I said, my voice trembling. But right now, we don't have time for shame. Your mother is very sick. Her heart is failing. She is waiting for you. Daniel looked at me in absolute shock. The realization of what his silence had done hit him harder than any financial failure. Within 10 minutes, we packed his small bag, got into the car, and began the long drive back to our small town. The entire journey, Daniel held his head in his hands, whispering apologies. I kept my hand on his shoulder, driving through the night. When we finally arrived at the hospital, the morning light was just breaking. We walked into Emily's room. She looked so small and frail under the white sheets. Her eyes closed, breathing weakly. Daniel took a slow step toward the bed. He reached out and gently touched her pale hand. "Mom," he choked out, his voice cracking. "Mom, it's me." Emily's fluttered. For a second, she looked confused. Then a beautiful, radiant smile spread across her tired face. She didn't ask where he had been. She didn't ask why he hadn't called. She just lifted her weak arms and pulled him into a warm embrace. "My boy," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "I knew you would come. I stood by the window, watching them, tears flowing freely down my face. Our house was still old, my hands were still rough, and our future was uncertain. But as I looked at my wife and son holding each other, I realized that our family was finally whole again. Love wasn't about being perfect. It was about always leaving the door open for the people we love to find their way back home. The drive home felt completely different. For 15 years, I had imagined this moment, wondering whether my son still thought about us. Now he sat beside me in silence. As the miles passed, Daniel finally spoke. I called several times. He whispered, his voice cracking. Years ago, after everything collapsed, I picked up the phone dozens of times. But every time I imagined explaining my failures to you and Mom, I couldn't do it. I understood. The world teaches people to celebrate success, but rarely does it teach them how to survive failure. Many believe love must be earned. But parents don't stop loving their children when they fail. By the time we reached our town, the sun was setting. When our house finally appeared, Daniel froze. The same fence, the same porch, the same garden Emily loved so much. Tears filled his eyes. "I don't deserve this." I parked the car and looked at him. "Son, there is no such thing as deserving your mother's love." We walked toward the front door together. Inside, Emily was sitting in her favourite chair near the window, a blanket covering her weak legs. She looked up when she heard the door. At first, she smiled at me, then she noticed the figure standing behind me. Everything became completely still. The entire world seemed to pause. "Daniel." Her voice was barely a whisper. My son broke instantly. "Mom," he cried. That single word shattered 15 years of distance. Emily stood up to quickly, ignoring her weakness. All she could see was her son, the child she had waited for every single day. Daniel fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Emily wrapped her arms around him and held him the same way she had when he was little. No anger, no accusations, no bitterness. Only love that evening. We sat together at the dinner table for the first time in 15 years. The empty chair was finally filled again. Over the following weeks, Daniel stayed with us, helping around the house and driving Emily to her appointments. Slowly, life began to feel whole again. One afternoon, he stood in the backyard staring at his old childhood swing. "I used to think success would make me happy," he sighed sadly. "It turns out success means very little when you have nobody to share it with." I nodded. Because money can buy comfort, but it can never replace family. As months passed, Emily's condition stabilized. For the first time in years, hope felt real. The following year, Daniel moved back permanently. Not because he had nowhere else to go, but because he finally understood where he belonged. He started over, found work nearby, and rebuilt his life. But this time he measured differently, not by money or status, but by relationships and moments. Years later, during Emily's 70th birthday, our home was filled with music and laughter. I watched Daniel helping his mother cut the cake, both smiling, and I realized something important. For years, I believed our story was about loss and heartbreak. But I was wrong. Our story was really about hope. Hope is what kept Emily looking out that window. Hope is what pushed me to search. Hope is what brought us back together. Before going to bed that night, I stepped onto the porch alone under the stars. I heard the front door open, and Daniel walked outside. He looked at me and smiled. "Thanks for coming to find me, Dad." I felt my throat tighten. The truth was, I had not saved him. A father's job isn't to save his children forever. Sometimes it is simply to remind them that they are still loved, no matter how far they wander or how badly they fail. I placed a hand on his shoulder and looked up at the sky. There was no emptiness in my heart anymore, only gratitude, because life had given us a second chance, the greatest miracle of all.